Some wounds never heal, they just teach us how to carry them. When 42-year-old widow Nora Caldwell bought an entire ghost town for almost nothing, everyone thought grief had finally broken her mind. But walking those empty streets with her dog Bandit, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: purpose. The town seemed to whisper secrets through its broken windows and crumbling walls. Then Bandit started digging at an old storefront and uncovered something that had been buried for decades. What he found would change everything Nora thought she knew about loss, about healing, and about why some places are meant to stay forgotten. But what was buried beneath that old building that no one was supposed to find? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain air carried a bite of autumn as Nora Caldwell stood on the porch of her remote cabin, watching the morning mist lift from the valley below. 5 years had passed since David's climbing accident. 5 years since the avalanche that took him and left her with nothing but memories and an aching silence that echoed through every room of their shared dreams. The cabin they'd built together with their own hands now felt more like a monument to what she'd lost than a home where she could live. She reached down to scratch behind Bandit's ears, the German shepherd mix, who had been David's companion on shorter hikes and her constant companion in grief. The dog's amber eyes held the same weary wisdom she felt in her bones, the understanding that some losses reshape you so completely that you barely recognize the person you used to be. The newspaper clipping lay on the kitchen table where she'd left it 3 days ago, creased from handling and circled in red ink. Millfield Ghost Town Auction. Minimum bid $5,000. She'd driven the 120 miles to the county courthouse on impulse, telling herself she was just curious about what kind of fool would buy an abandoned town in the middle of nowhere. She hadn't expected to raise her hand when the auctioneer called for bids. She certainly hadn't expected to find herself the sole bidder at $12,000, every cent of her emergency savings. The drive to Millfield took her through landscape that shifted from pine forests to high desert, the familiar mountains giving way to red rock formations and sagebrush. Bandit sat alert in the passenger seat, nose pressed to the window as new scents filtered through the crack she'd left open. The GPS lost signal 20 miles before their destination, but the hand-drawn map from the courthouse clerk proved reliable enough to guide them down increasingly rough roads until they crested a hill and saw it spread before them. Millfield stretched across a natural depression between two mesas. 47 buildings arranged along 3 main streets with the precision of a town planned for growth that never came. The structures stood frozen in the 1950s, white-clapboard houses with wraparound porches, a 2-story general store with faded Coca-Cola signs, a small church with a bell tower that listed slightly to the left. It looked like a movie set after the crew had gone home. Everything positioned perfectly but utterly empty of life. Nora parked her truck in front of what had once been the main street's focal point, a 2-story building with Millfield General Store and Post Office painted in faded letters across its front. The wooden sidewalks creaked under her boots as she walked, Bandit trotting beside her with his tail held high in that way that meant he found something interesting about this place. The silence was profound, but not peaceful. It felt expectant, as if the town were holding its breath. Empty windows stared down at her from second-story apartments, their glass intact, but clouded with decades of dust. Front doors hung slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of furniture still arranged, as if families had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. She tried the general store's front door and found it unlocked. The interior smelled of old wood and something else, a mustiness that spoke of time standing still. Shelves lined the walls, empty now except for a few scattered items, a box of rusted nails, several glass jars with handwritten labels too faded to read, a child's toy horse carved from wood and worn smooth by small hands. The horse was painted brown and white, clearly loved, clearly left behind in haste. "What do you think, boy?" she asked Bandit, who was investigating the corners with scientific thoroughness. "Think we can make something of this place?" The dog looked up at her with an expression that might have been skepticism, then returned to his exploration. He paused at the back corner of the store, near what had been the candy counter, and whined softly. When Nora approached, she saw scratches in the wooden floor, deep gouges that looked fresh despite the building's abandonment. Her phone had no signal, but she'd expected that. The courthouse clerk had warned her that cell service was spotty at best, and the nearest neighbor was 15 miles away. The town had its own well, she'd been told, and some of the electrical infrastructure was still intact, though it would need significant work to be functional again. She spent the rest of the morning walking the streets with Bandit, taking mental inventory of what she'd bought. The houses were modest but well-built, with solid foundations and roofs that had weathered decades remarkably well. The school was a single-room building with desks still arranged in neat rows, a blackboard covered in chalk dust, and children's artwork tacked to bulletin boards, faded but still visible after all these years. The church was the most peaceful building, its interior dim and cool despite the desert heat outside. Wooden pews faced a simple altar, and colored light filtered through stained glass windows depicting scenes of pastoral life. Someone had left a Bible open on the pulpit, its pages yellowed but the text still readable. Nora found herself drawn to sit in the front pew, the silence wrapping around her like a familiar coat. It was there that she first felt it, the sense of being watched. Not malevolently, but with the intensity of someone who had been waiting a very long time for company. She turned to look behind her, but the church was empty except for Bandit, who had settled near the door with his head on his paws. By evening, she'd chosen the general store as her temporary base camp. The apartment above it was furnished with basics: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a kitchen area with a wood stove that would provide heat when the desert nights turned cold. She'd brought camping gear and enough supplies for a week, though she found herself thinking she might need longer to fully understand what she'd gotten herself into. As the sun set behind the western mesa, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Nora sat on the store's front porch with a cup of coffee made on her camp stove. Bandit lay beside her chair, but she noticed his ears kept swiveling toward sounds she couldn't hear. The desert evening brought its own symphony of coyotes and wind through empty buildings. But underneath it all was something else, a sense of presence that made the hair on her arms stand up. She'd bought this place on impulse, driven by grief and a desperate need to escape the memories that haunted her cabin. But sitting here now, watching shadows lengthen across the empty street, she wondered if she'd simply traded one haunted place for another. The difference was that her cabin was haunted by her own ghosts, memories of David, dreams they'd shared, a future that would never be. This place felt haunted by someone else's story, someone else's unfinished business. The thought should have frightened her, but instead it filled her with something she hadn't experienced in 5 years: curiosity. For the first time since David's death, she wanted to know what happened next. She wanted to understand the story this place was trying to tell her. Bandit suddenly sat up, alert and focused on something across the street. His tail didn't wag, but he didn't growl either, just watched with the intense concentration of a dog, seeing something his human couldn't. Nora followed his gaze, but saw only shadows and empty buildings. The school visible in the distance with its windows reflecting the last light of day. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly, but Bandit maintained his vigil until full darkness fell and whatever he'd been watching disappeared into the night. That first night in Millfield, Nora dreamed of children's laughter echoing through empty streets and woke to find Bandit sitting by the window, staring out at the town below as if he were keeping watch over something precious and fragile. She joined him at the window, looking out at the moonlit buildings, and felt a strange peace settle over her. Whatever secrets this place held, whatever brought her here, she was exactly where she needed to be. The realization surprised her with its certainty. For 5 years, she'd felt like a ship without an anchor, drifting through days that all looked the same. But standing here in this forgotten place, with her faithful dog beside her and the vast desert stretching away in all directions, she felt something click into place, a sense of purpose she'd thought died with David. Tomorrow she would start exploring in earnest, would begin the process of understanding what Millfield had been and what it might become again. But tonight she was content to stand watch with Bandit. Two souls keeping vigil over a town that felt like it had been waiting for them all along. The second morning in Millfield dawned clear and cold, the kind of desert morning that made Nora grateful for the flannel shirt she'd packed. She made coffee on the camp stove and sat on the general store's front steps, watching Bandit explore the street with systematic thoroughness. The dog had developed a routine, checking the same corners, sniffing the same doorways, always returning to that spot behind the store where he'd whined the day before. When he began pawing at the ground there, Nora initially thought he'd found something biological that interested him. Dogs had their own priorities, after all. But his behavior was different from his usual investigations, more purposeful, almost urgent. He would dig for a few minutes, look back at her expectantly, then return to his work when she didn't respond. "All right, what's so fascinating about that spot?" she finally asked, walking over with her coffee cup still warming her hands. The area behind the general store had once been a loading dock of sorts, with weathered wooden planks that had warped and split over the decades. Bandit had been focusing on a section where the boards had pulled apart, creating a gap just wide enough for his paws to fit through. When Nora knelt beside him, she could see he'd already moved several inches of packed dirt and debris. "You're going to wear your claws down to nothing," she told him. But something in the way he looked at her made her reconsider. David used to say that dogs knew things humans missed, that they could sense changes in weather, earthquakes, even illness before people realized anything was wrong. Maybe Bandit was trying to tell her something important. She went back to her truck and retrieved a small folding shovel from her emergency kit. The ground was harder than she'd expected, packed down by decades of rain and settling. But as she worked, following Bandit's lead, she began to understand why he'd been so interested in this particular spot. The dirt here wasn't the same as the surrounding area. It was looser, as if it had been disturbed and backfilled at some point. 20 minutes of careful digging revealed the first artifact, a small leather shoe, child-sized, with laces still intact despite its time underground. The leather was darkened and cracked, but remarkably preserved in the dry desert soil. Nora lifted it carefully, turning it over in her hands, while Bandit watched with what she could only describe as satisfaction. The shoe was old, 1960s based on the style, and had been made for a girl, judging by the small buckle detail near the ankle. It was the kind of shoe a parent would buy for special occasions, church or school pictures, something meant to last and be treasured. The fact that it had ended up buried behind an abandoned building made Nora's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't immediately name. She photographed the shoe with her phone, then wrapped it carefully in a clean towel and placed it in her truck. The rational part of her mind suggested it could have been lost during the town's abandonment, dropped and covered by shifting dirt over the years. But the careful way it had been positioned and the depth at which she'd found it suggested something more deliberate. The drive to the county courthouse took 2 hours, but Nora felt compelled to make the trip that same day. The shoe seemed to demand immediate attention, as if it had been waiting underground specifically for someone who would understand its significance. The elderly clerk who had handled the auction paperwork looked up with surprise when she walked in. "Miss Caldwell, didn't expect to see you back so soon. Having second thoughts about your purchase?" "No, nothing like that. I was hoping you might have records about Millfield's history. Who lived there, why it was abandoned, that sort of thing." The clerk's expression shifted to something more cautious. "Well, most of the official records would be in the archives downstairs. What specifically are you looking for?" Nora unwrapped the shoe and placed it gently on the counter. "I found this buried behind one of the buildings. It belonged to a child, probably from the 1960s. I'd like to know whose it was." The color drained from the clerk's face so rapidly that Nora feared the woman might faint. She gripped the edge of the counter and stared at the shoe as if it was something dangerous. "Margaret," Nora read from the name tag. "Are you all right? Where exactly did you find this?" Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. "Behind the general store. My dog kept digging there, and I thought I should see what had caught his attention." Margaret looked around the office, confirming they were alone, then leaned closer. "You need to put that back where you found it. Right now, today. Don't ask questions, don't keep digging, just put it back and leave that place alone. I don't understand. It's just a child's shoe, it's not just anything." Margaret's voice carried a weight of years, of secrets kept too long. "That belonged to Emma Hartwell. She was 6 years old when her family disappeared in 1964. They never found the bodies." The words hit Nora like cold water. She looked down at the small shoe with new understanding, seeing not just a lost artifact, but evidence of a child who had vanished more than half a century ago. What happened to them? Margaret glanced around again, then pulled out a thick folder from beneath the counter. "Officially. Flash flood took them during a family picnic. Happened fast, bodies washed downstream, never recovered." That's what the paper said, what everyone was told to believe. And unofficially, there were a lot of questions that never got answered. 23 families lived in Millfield when the Hartwells disappeared. Within 2 weeks of the incident, every single one of them had packed up and moved away. You don't abandon a perfectly good town because of one tragic accident, no matter how terrible. Nora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the courthouse's air conditioning. The auction listing said the town had been abandoned since the 1960s. It didn't mention why, because officially there's no mystery. Family dies in flood, town gradually empties as the mine operation wound down. Property eventually escheated to the county for unpaid taxes. Clean, simple, no questions asked. Margaret's voice carried decades of frustration. "But I grew up in the area, Ms. Caldwell. I was 12 when the Hartwells disappeared, and I remember the fear in people's eyes. Whatever happened to that family, it scared the entire town into running." Margaret opened the folder and pulled out several yellowed newspaper clippings. The headlines were stark. "Local family missing after flash flood. Search continues for Hartwell family. Millfield residents relocate after tragedy." The photograph accompanying the first article showed 3 people standing in front of a modest house. A man in work clothes, a woman in a floral dress, and a little girl with dark pigtails, wearing a white dress and small leather shoes that were unmistakably identical to the one now sitting on the counter between them. "That's them," Margaret said unnecessarily. "Robert Hartwell worked at the copper mine. Linda taught Sunday school at the church. Emma was their only child, born late in their marriage when they thought they couldn't have children. The whole town treated her like she belonged to everyone." Nora studied the photograph, trying to reconcile the smiling family with the tragedy that had followed. Emma Hartwell looked like any happy 6-year-old, gap-toothed grin and bright eyes full of mischief. The idea that this child had suffered some terrible fate made Nora's hands clench involuntarily. "The flood story, you don't believe it?" "I believe there was a flood. I believe the family was never seen again after that day. But I don't believe those are the only facts that matter." Margaret lowered her voice further. "My father was part of the search and rescue team. He told me years later when I was grown that something about the whole thing felt wrong. The flood came from the wrong direction, washed away too specific an area, and the search was called off too quickly for his liking. What did he think really happened? He thought someone with authority wanted those bodies to stay lost. And he thought the other families in Millfield got the message loud and clear that asking too many questions would be dangerous for their own health." Nora carefully rewrapped the shoe, her mind racing with implications. Who had that kind of authority in 1964? Sheriff's Department, mine company management, maybe county officials. Hard to say. Most of the people involved are dead now, and the ones who aren't have kept quiet for 60 years. Not likely to start talking to a stranger just because she bought an abandoned town. The drive back to Millfield felt longer than the morning trip. the small shoe on the passenger seat seeming to carry the weight of an entire family's tragedy. Nora's initial excitement about her impulsive purchase had transformed into something deeper and more complex, a sense of responsibility she hadn't anticipated. By the time she reached the town, evening shadows were lengthening across the empty streets. Bandit greeted her return with enthusiasm, tail wagging as if she'd been gone for days instead of hours. But when she unwrapped the shoe and showed it to him, his demeanor changed. He sniffed it carefully, whined softly, then looked up at her with an expression of unmistakable sorrow. "You knew, didn't you?" she asked him. "Somehow you knew this was important." She spent the evening researching what little information was available online about the Hartwell family and the town's abandonment. The official records were sparse and carefully sanitized, matching Margaret's description of a simple flood tragedy. But between the lines, she began to see the shape of something larger, a story that had been deliberately obscured, questions that had been systematically discouraged. As she prepared for her second night in Millfield, Nora made a decision that would have surprised her former self. Instead of returning Emma's shoe to where Bandit had found it, she placed it carefully on the general store's counter where she could see it from the apartment upstairs. If the shoe had been buried to hide evidence, then bringing it back to light felt like the right thing to do that night. For the first time since David's death, Nora fell asleep thinking about someone else's loss, someone else's unfinished story. And in her dreams, she heard the sound of a little girl calling for her mother, a voice that seemed to come from very far away, but felt as immediate as her own heartbeat. The third day dawned with Nora feeling a sense of purpose that had been absent from her life for 5 years. She woke early, made coffee, and stood at the apartment window looking down at the empty street while Bandit stretched and yawned beside her. Today, she would begin systematic exploration of the town, starting with the schoolhouse where Emma Hartwell had spent her last days as a living child. The one-room school building sat at the end of Main Street, its white paint weathered but intact. The front door opened with a creak that echoed through the interior, and morning light streaming through tall windows illuminated a scene frozen in time. Rows of wooden desks faced a blackboard where someone had written, November 15th, 1964, in careful cursive script, just 3 days before the Hartwell family disappeared. Nora walked slowly between the desk rows, her footsteps muffled by decades of dust. Most surfaces were empty, cleared when the school closed, but children had a way of hiding treasures in the most unlikely places. She began checking desk compartments methodically, finding the usual detritus of young lives: broken pencils, a marble, scraps of paper with illegible writing. The third desk from the front, right side, yielded something more significant. Wedged into the back corner of the storage compartment was a small composition notebook, its cover decorated with horses drawn in colored pencil. The name Emma Hartwell was written on the cover in a child's careful handwriting, with little flowers dotting the eyes. Nora lifted the notebook with the same care she'd used for the shoe, feeling the weight of another person's memories in her hands. She carried it to the teacher's desk and opened it in the pool of sunlight from the nearest window. The first pages contained arithmetic problems and spelling words, the kind of assignments that formed the backbone of elementary education in any era. But interspersed with the schoolwork were drawings, horses in every possible pose and situation. Horses running through fields, horses with children on their backs, horses with flowing manes and kind eyes. Emma had clearly been obsessed with them, and her artistic skill was remarkable for a 6-year-old. On one page, she'd written a story titled My Horse Dream in careful block letters. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who wanted a horse more than anything. She dreamed about horses every night and drew pictures of them every day. Her mama said maybe when she got older they could get a horse. Her papa said horses were expensive, but he would try to save money. The little girl knew they would keep their promise because they loved her very much. The innocence of it broke Nora's heart. She could picture Emma sitting at this very desk, pencil gripped tightly in small fingers, carefully forming each letter while dreaming of a future that would never come. The notebook contained dozens of such stories and drawings, a window into the mind of a creative, hopeful child. Toward the back of the notebook, the drawings changed. The horses were still there, but they looked different, sad somehow. Their heads were lowered, their eyes less bright. And there were other figures, shadowy people standing at the edges of the drawings, always in the background, always watching. The last entry was dated November 17th, 1964, the day before the family disappeared. It wasn't a story or a drawing, but a single line written in Emma's careful script. "The sad people want to show me something." Nora stared at those words for a long time, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air filtering through the old building. What had Emma seen in the days before her death? Who were the sad people she wrote about? Bandit, who had been exploring the school's corners, suddenly appeared at her side and whined softly. He was staring toward the back of the room, ears alert and tail still. Nora followed his gaze but saw only empty space and morning shadows. "What is it, boy?" The dog took several steps toward the back corner, then stopped and looked back at her expectantly. She gathered up Emma's notebook and followed him, trusting his instincts as she had learned to do. In the corner, half hidden behind a forgotten easel, was another desk smaller than the others, clearly intended for the youngest students. This desk's compartment contained more treasures: crayons worn down to nubs, a small bottle filled with colored stones, and a piece of paper folded into a tiny square. When Nora unfolded it, she found a drawing that made her breath catch. The picture showed the schoolhouse itself, but Emma had added details that weren't visible in reality. Dark figures stood at each window looking in. At the bottom of the page, in carefully printed letters, Emma had written, "They watch us at school too." Nora felt the notebook and drawing were speaking to something larger than a child's imagination. She photographed each page carefully with her phone, then wrapped both items in a clean cloth and placed them in her truck next to Emma's shoe. Around noon, she spotted a pickup truck approaching on the main road, the first vehicle she'd seen since arriving. It pulled up in front of the general store, and a man in his 50s climbed out. He was tall and lean, with weathered hands, and the kind of tan that came from working outdoors. His expression was cautious but not unfriendly. "You must be the woman who bought this place," he said, extending a hand. "Jake Morrison. I'm a contractor out of Cedar Falls." "Nora Caldwell." His handshake was firm and calloused. "What brings you all the way out here?" "Heard someone had finally purchased Millfield. Thought you might need someone who knows about renovating old buildings." He gestured toward the structures around them. "These places have good bones, but they'll need significant work to be habitable again." Something about his manner suggested this wasn't a purely business visit. "You seem to know the area well." "Born and raised in Cedar Falls. My grandfather lived here in Millfield until—" He paused, choosing his words carefully, "until the town emptied out in the 60s. Nora felt a spark of interest. "Did he ever talk about why people left so suddenly?" Jake's expression grew more guarded. "He wasn't much for talking about those days. Said some things were better left buried." He glanced around the empty street, then back at her. "Mind if I ask what you're planning to do with this place?" "I'm not entirely sure yet. I bought it on impulse, if I'm being honest. But now that I'm here, I feel like there's a story that needs to be told." "What kind of story?" Nora studied his face, trying to gauge how much she should reveal. Something about Jake Morrison suggested he might be an ally, but Margaret's warnings about asking too many questions echoed in her mind. "I found some items that belong to the Hartwell family. I'm trying to understand what really happened to them." The change in Jake's demeanor was immediate and striking. He went very still, and when he spoke again, his voice was careful and controlled. "Ms. Caldwell, I don't know what you think you're going to accomplish, but digging into that particular tragedy isn't going to bring anyone peace." "How can you be so certain?" "Because my grandfather was part of the search and rescue operation. He spent 2 weeks looking for those bodies, and when the official search was called off, he kept looking on his own for another month. He never found so much as a scrap of clothing, and it ate at him for the rest of his life. This matched what Margaret had told her about the search efforts. "Your grandfather, is he still alive?" "Died 10 years ago. But he made me promise never to come back to this place, never to ask questions about what happened here. Said some secrets were kept secret for good reasons." Nora felt frustration building in her chest. Everyone seemed to know more than they were willing to say, and their reluctance only convinced her that Emma Hartwell deserved better than the official silence that had surrounded her family's fate. "Mr. Morrison, a 6-year-old girl, died here. Her family died here. Doesn't that matter to anyone?" "Of course it matters." His voice softened slightly. "But sometimes trying to fix old wrongs just creates new problems. My grandfather learned that the hard way." Before Nora could ask what he meant, Bandit appeared around the corner of the general store, moving with purpose towards something that had caught his attention. The dog paused to look back at them, tail wagging, clearly expecting to be followed. "That's my dog," Nora explained. "He seems to have his own agenda for exploring this place." Jake watched Bandit's retreating figure with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Animals know things," he said quietly. "My grandfather used to say that dogs could sense things people missed, especially in places where something bad had happened." They followed Bandit toward the back of the town, past houses with empty windows and gardens gone to seed. The dog led them to a building Nora hadn't fully explored yet, what appeared to be a small mining office, its windows boarded up and its door secured with a rusty chain. Bandit sat in front of the building and barked once, sharp and insistent. Then he looked back at them with the same expectant expression he'd worn when he found Emma's shoe. "He wants us to go inside," Nora said. Jake examined the chain more closely. "This lock is newer than it should be. Someone's been maintaining the security on this place." He pulled a multi-tool from his pocket and studied the mechanism. "I could get us in, but once we cross that threshold, there's no going back to not knowing whatever's in there." Nora looked at the boarded windows, then at Bandit, who continued to sit patiently by the door, as if waiting for the humans to catch up to what he already understood. Emma's notebook talked about sad people who wanted to show her something. Maybe this is what they wanted her to see, and maybe that's exactly why we shouldn't look. But even as Jake spoke the warning, he was working on the lock. It clicked open after a few minutes of careful manipulation, and the chain fell away with a sound that seemed too loud in the desert silence. The door swung open to reveal darkness and the smell of old paper and metal. Jake pulled out his phone's flashlight, and they stepped inside together. The interior was clearly an office space, desks, filing cabinets, and a large map of the mine shafts covering one wall. But what made both of them stop breathing was what they found scattered across the floor. Dozens of photographs, all showing the same scene from different angles. The photos depicted 3 bodies at the bottom of what appeared to be a mine shaft. Even in the poor light and aged condition of the pictures, there was no mistaking the floral dress, the work clothes, and the small white dress that matched the one Emma wore in the newspaper photograph. In the corner of each photo, stamped in faded red ink, were the words, "Evidence, property of Sheriff's Dept," and a date, November 20th, 1964, 2 days after the Hartwell family was supposed to have been swept away by a flood. The photographs lay scattered across the mining office floor like accusatory ghosts, each one a piece of evidence that should have changed everything, but instead had been hidden away for 60 years. Nora knelt carefully among them, using her phone's light to examine the images more closely, while Jake stood guard at the door. "These were taken 2 days after the supposed flood," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "The sheriff's department knew exactly where the bodies were." Jake picked up one of the photographs, studying the timestamp with grim fascination. "My grandfather spent a month searching every creek and wash within 50 miles. The whole time, they knew the family was at the bottom of a mine shaft. The implications were staggering. Not only had the Hartwell family been murdered, but law enforcement had actively covered it up, allowing the real killer to go free while an entire town lived in fear. Nora photographed each evidence photo with her phone, making sure to capture the official stamps and dates clearly. Behind the desk, they found a filing cabinet that contained more revelations. The folders were labeled with names Nora didn't recognize, but the contents told a story of systematic intimidation and payoffs. Bank deposits matched to specific dates, letters threatening families who asked too many questions, and most damning of all, a handwritten note that simply read, "Problem solved. Town will be empty within the month. Payment as agreed." JS, Jake said, reading over her shoulder. "Any idea who that might be?" "Sheriff's name was James Steele, according to the newspaper articles," Nora replied. "But we need more than initials to prove anything." They spent another hour carefully documenting everything in the office, but Jake's earlier warning about crossing thresholds proved prophetic. As they prepared to leave, they heard the sound of vehicles approaching on the main road, multiple engines moving fast. "That's not good," Jake muttered, peering through a gap in the boarded windows. 3 trucks, government plates. "Someone knows we're here." They quickly gathered the most important photographs and documents, stuffing them into Nora's jacket while Jake secured the office door behind them. But as they emerged from the building, they found themselves facing 2 men in dark suits who had clearly been waiting for them. "Ms. Caldwell," the older man said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm Agent Harrison, FBI. We need to talk." The conversation that followed took place in the general store, with Agent Harrison and his partner occupying the space, like they owned it, while Nora and Jake sat on opposite sides of the room. Bandit positioned himself between Nora and the agents, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "You've stumbled onto a matter of federal concern," Harrison explained, his tone suggesting this was more warning than information. The Hartwell case was closed decades ago, and reopening it would serve no useful purpose. "A family was murdered," Nora said flatly. "Their killer was never brought to justice." "How is that not useful to pursue?" "Because the people responsible are dead, Ms. Caldwell. Sheriff Steele died in 1987. The mine owner who paid him died 5 years later. Justice, such as it is, has been served by time." Jake leaned forward in his chair. "What about the families who were forced to leave town? What about the cover-up that let a murderer walk free for 23 years? Agent Harrison's partner spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a subtle threat. "Some events are better left undisturbed. The town was abandoned for good reasons, and those reasons haven't changed." The federal interest puzzled Nora until she remembered something from Robert Hartwell's journal, his mention of unusual mineral formations in the mine. "This isn't about the Hartwell family at all, is it? It's about what's in that mine." Harrison's expression didn't change, but his silence was answer enough. "Miss Caldwell, you bought this property in good faith, and no one wants to interfere with your legal ownership. But some areas of the town are off limits for safety reasons. The mine shafts, in particular, are extremely dangerous." "Dangerous how? Structurally unsound or dangerous because of what might be found there?" "Both," Harrison said simply. "I strongly suggest you focus your restoration efforts on the residential areas and leave the industrial sections alone." After the agents left, Nora and Jake sat in the lengthening shadows of the general store, trying to process what they'd learned. The federal involvement suggested the Hartwell murders were connected to something much larger than a simple cover-up. Something that still mattered enough to draw government attention 60 years later. "We need help," Jake said finally. "Someone who knows the real history of this place. Someone who was here when it happened." Nora thought about the photograph she'd found in Emma's room, the one showing the little girl with a man identified as Uncle Vernon. If Vernon was still alive, if his memory was intact, he might be their only link to the truth about what happened to the Hartwell family. "There might be someone," she said. "An old man named Vernon Walsh. He was supposed to meet the Hartwells at the mine the day they disappeared." Jake's face went pale. "Vernon Walsh? He's alive?" "You know him?" "He's my great-uncle. My grandfather's younger brother." Jake's voice carried a mixture of shock and understanding. "Grandpa never told me Vernon was involved with the Hartwells." never even mentioned they knew each other. The family connection explained why Jake's grandfather had been so adamant about staying away from Millfield, why he'd made Jake promise never to ask questions about the town's history. If Vernon Walsh had been the Hartwells' contact at the mine, if he'd been supposed to meet them the day they died, then Jake's family had been carrying guilt and secrets for 3 generations. That evening, as they prepared to make contact with Vernon Walsh, Nora moved her belongings from the general store to the Hartwell family home. The decision felt both practical and symbolic. If she was going to seek justice for Emma and her parents, she needed to fully commit to their story. The house welcomed her with the same strange sense of rightness she'd felt on her first night in Millfield. As she arranged her things in the guest room, she could almost feel the presence of the family who had lived here, their hopes and dreams still embedded in the walls and furniture. In Emma's room, she carefully placed the little girl's shoe on the nightstand next to the jewelry box, then opened the composition notebook to the page with the drawing of shadowy figures watching the school. The sad people Emma had written about, were they the spirits of earlier victims trying to warn her about the danger? Or were they something else entirely, guardians of secrets that someone powerful had wanted kept buried? That night, for the 3rd time since arriving in Millfield, Nora dreamed of Emma Hartwell. But this time the dream was different. Instead of the happy child from the family photographs, she saw Emma as she must have been in her final days. Frightened, confused, but also determined to understand what the sad people were trying to tell her. In the dream, Emma stood at the edge of the mine shaft, holding her father's hand while her mother waited nearby. Uncle Vernon was there too, an older man with kind eyes who seemed to be explaining something important. But before Nora could understand what they were discussing, the dream shifted, and she found herself alone in the mine office, staring at the scattered photographs, while a voice whispered, "Find Vernon. He knows what they did to us." She woke with Emma's words echoing in her mind, and the absolute certainty that time was running out. The federal agent's visit had been a warning. Continue digging, and there would be consequences. But Emma Hartwell had been waiting 60 years for someone to care enough about her story to risk those consequences. Tomorrow, they would find Vernon Walsh and learn the truth about what happened in the mine. Whatever that truth cost them, it had to be better than letting a child's murder remain hidden in the darkness. As dawn broke over Millfield, Nora made coffee in Linda Hartwell's kitchen and prepared for what might be the most important conversation of her life. Somewhere in a retirement home 50 miles away, an old man was carrying secrets that could finally bring peace to a little girl's spirit. The question was whether he would be willing to break 60 years of silence, and whether the truth he carried was worth the price. They might all have to pay for it. The call to Vernon Walsh took 3 attempts over 2 days. The first 2 times, the receptionist at Sunset Manor informed them that Mr. Walsh was having a difficult day and wasn't receiving visitors. On the 3rd try, Jake's mention of his grandfather's name and the word Millfield seemed to carry weight, and Vernon agreed to see them that afternoon. The drive to Sunset Manor took them through landscape that shifted from high desert back toward mountains, following a route that felt like traveling backward through time. The retirement community was modest but well-maintained, with adobe buildings arranged around courtyards filled with desert plants and shade trees. Vernon Walsh was waiting for them in the main lobby, a man in his late 70s, with sharp eyes and hands that shook slightly when he wasn't concentrating on keeping them still. He studied their faces with the intensity of someone who had learned to be careful about whom he trusted. "You're Jake Morrison," he said without preamble. "You look just like your grandfather did at your age. And you must be the woman who bought Millfield." His gaze shifted to Nora. "Heard through the grapevine that someone finally took that cursed place off the county's hands." They found a quiet corner of the community room, away from other residents and staff. Vernon moved slowly but with purpose, settling into his chair with the careful movements of someone managing chronic pain. When they were seated, he looked directly at Nora with an expression of profound sadness. "You found Emma's shoe, didn't you? That's what started all this." Nora's surprise must have shown on her face because Vernon's mouth curved in a bitter smile. Word travels fast in small communities, even 60 years later. Margaret at the courthouse called her cousin, who called her daughter, who happens to work here. By the time stories make that many jumps, they get distorted, but the core usually stays true. "Mr. Walsh," Jake began, but Vernon held up a trembling hand. "Call me Vernon. And before you ask me anything, you need to understand something about the burden you're taking on." His voice carried the weight of decades. "I've kept quiet about what happened to the Hartwells because staying quiet kept other people alive. If I break that silence now, it's because I'm old enough that the consequences don't scare me anymore." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It showed a much younger Vernon standing with Robert Hartwell in front of a mine entrance, both men wearing work clothes and holding geological surveying equipment. "Robert and I were partners," Vernon said, his voice growing softer. "Not just at the mine. We were investigating some irregularities in the mineral surveys, finding deposits that didn't match the official records. Equipment readings that suggested there was more valuable material in those shafts than anyone was admitting." Nora leaned forward. "What kind of material?" "Uranium. High-grade ore that wasn't supposed to exist in that geological formation." Vernon's hands steadied as he focused on the memory. This was 1964, remember? The Cold War was at its peak, and the government was desperate for domestic uranium sources. They had contracts with mining companies all over the Southwest, but most of those operations were legitimate and heavily regulated. Jake frowned. "Are you saying the Millfield mine was operating illegally?" "I'm saying the Millfield mine was producing uranium that never appeared on any government manifest. Robert and I started noticing discrepancies in the shipping records, or going out at night, truck convoys that didn't match the paperwork, that sort of thing. We thought we were investigating simple tax evasion or maybe black market sales." Vernon paused to take a sip from a water glass, his hands shaking slightly. "We had no idea we were stumbling onto a federal operation. Turns out the government was running an off-books uranium extraction program using private companies as cover. The official story was copper mining, but they were pulling weapons-grade uranium out of those shafts and shipping it directly to Los Alamos. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a picture that explained the federal agents' interest in keeping the mine closed. And Emma somehow knew about this?" "Emma was a special child," Vernon said, his voice growing tender. "She had what people used to call the sight. She could sense things that weren't immediately obvious. She started having dreams about the mine weeks before she disappeared. Dreams about sad people underground who wanted to tell her something important." He pulled out another photograph. This one showing Emma sitting on Vernon's shoulders while he pointed towards something in the distance. "She started asking me questions about the mine, about why the trucks came at night, about why some of the men who worked there looked scared all the time. I made the mistake of thinking she was just curious." "What happened the day they disappeared?" Nora asked gently. Vernon was quiet for so long that she wondered if he'd forgotten the question. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Robert had arranged to meet me at the old mine entrance after church that Sunday. He wanted to show me something Emma had found. She'd been drawing pictures of specific mine shafts, drawings that showed details she couldn't have known unless she'd been inside them." He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellow with age. When he unfolded it, Nora saw it was one of Emma's drawings, but unlike the ones in her notebook, this one was precise and technical. It showed a detailed cross-section of mine tunnels, with specific notations about depth and direction. "She drew this 3 days before they died," Vernon continued. "Drew it without ever being inside that mine, but every detail was accurate. Robert thought maybe Emma was somehow seeing the spirits of miners who died in earlier accidents, that they were trying to tell her about dangerous areas." Jake studied the drawing closely. "This looks like an engineering diagram. How could a 6-year-old produce something this detailed?" That's what Robert and I couldn't understand. But Emma insisted the sad people had shown her exactly where to look, had told her that something important was hidden in the deepest parts of the mine. Vernon's voice cracked slightly. "We thought we were investigating mineral theft. We had no idea we were walking into a government conspiracy." "So you met them at the mine that Sunday?" "I was supposed to, but I got delayed. My truck broke down about 5 miles out of town, and by the time I walked to the mine entrance, they were already gone." Vernon's hands clenched into fists. "I found Robert's geological equipment at the entrance, scattered like there'd been a struggle. And I found this." He reached into his pocket one more time and pulled out a small wooden cross, identical to the one Nora had found in the church. Emma always carried this. Robert carved it for her 6th birthday, just 2 months before they died. The cross felt warm in Nora's hands, smooth from handling and marked with the same initials she'd seen before. "E.H. You kept this all these years?" "I kept it as evidence. Evidence that something happened to that family that had nothing to do with any flood." Vernon's voice grew stronger, fueled by decades of suppressed anger. "I spent the next week trying to find them, searching every accessible part of that mine system. But on the Wednesday after they disappeared, Sheriff Steele paid me a visit." "What did he tell you?" "He told me that asking questions about the Hartwell family would be bad for my health. He told me that the mine was being sealed permanently for safety reasons, and that anyone found trespassing would be arrested for federal crimes. And he told me that if I valued the safety of my own family, I'd stop looking and stop talking." Vernon leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 78 years. "I was 24 years old, Ms. Caldwell. I had a young wife and a baby on the way. When a federal agent shows up at your door and explains that your friends died because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that you could easily join them if you're not careful, you listen. Federal agent." Sheriff Steele wasn't working alone. He had backing from people with authority that went way beyond county law enforcement. They made it very clear that the Hartwell case was closed, and that anyone who tried to reopen it would disappear just as completely. Nora felt pieces clicking into place. So the flood story was created to explain their disappearance. The flood story was created to stop people from asking where they really died. Hard to investigate a murder when everyone believes the victims were washed away by natural disaster. Vernon's laugh was bitter. They picked the perfect cover story, tragic but not suspicious, final but not investigable. Jake had been listening intently, his face growing paler with each revelation. "Uncle Vernon, why didn't you ever tell my grandfather about this? He spent years feeling guilty about not finding them." "Because your grandfather was a good man who would have tried to do something about it, and that would have gotten him killed." Vernon's voice carried the weight of a decision that had haunted him for decades. "I let him think I'd moved away because I couldn't handle the guilt. Better he think I was a coward than risk him becoming another victim." The room fell silent, except for the distant sounds of the retirement community. Residents talking, staff moving through hallways. The ordinary rhythms of life going on while they discussed decades-old murder and conspiracy. Finally, Nora spoke. "Vernon, I found photographs in the mine office. Evidence photos taken 2 days after the supposed flood, showing the Hartwells' bodies at the bottom of a mine shaft." Vernon's face went white. "You found the evidence room? How is that possible?" "They told me everything had been destroyed. Someone maintained it. Someone wanted that evidence preserved, even if it couldn't be used." "Then there's still hope," Vernon whispered. "After all these years, there's still hope for justice." He leaned forward, gripping Nora's hand with surprising strength. "But you need to understand what you're up against. The people who killed the Hartwells weren't just local criminals. They were part of a federal operation that probably involved millions of dollars and national security concerns. Even 60 years later, there are people who have reasons to keep that secret buried, like the FBI agents who visited me yesterday." Vernon's grip tightened. "They know you're getting close, which means You're running out of time before they decide you're too dangerous to ignore." As they prepared to leave, Vernon pressed something into Nora's hand, a small key attached to a tarnished chain. "This opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Cedar Falls. Box number 247. I've been paying the rental fee for 60 years, waiting for someone who might be able to use what's inside. What's in it? Everything Robert and I documented about the uranium operation. Shipping records, mineral assays, photographs of the illegal extraction equipment." Vernon's smile was grim but determined. "I told you I kept quiet to protect people. But I never said I didn't gather evidence while I was keeping quiet." The drive back to Millfield passed in contemplative silence, both of them processing the magnitude of what Vernon had revealed. They were no longer investigating a simple murder or even a local cover-up. They were uncovering a federal conspiracy that had cost at least 3 lives and potentially many more. As they approached the town, Nora noticed something that made her blood run cold. Smoke was rising from the direction of the Hartwell house, and she could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles on the main street. "Step on it," she told Jake, her heart pounding with the certainty that their investigation had just taken a dangerous new turn. The fire had been carefully set. That much was obvious from the pattern of burn damage and the fact that it had been confined to the kitchen and dining room of the Hartwell house, leaving the rest of the structure intact. The volunteer fire department from Cedar Falls had responded quickly, but not before the flames had destroyed most of Nora's personal belongings and sent a message that was impossible to misinterpret. Electrical. "Fire," the fire chief explained to Nora and Jake as they stood in the smoky aftermath. "Old wiring, probably sparked when you turned on too many appliances at once. These old houses weren't built for modern electrical loads." But Nora had been careful about the electrical system, and Jake had personally inspected the wiring just days before. More tellingly, Bandit had been found locked in the general store with a note tied to his collar. "This is your only warning. Leave Millfield or join the Hartwells." The message was written on modern paper in block letters, but it was signed with a symbol that made Vernon Walsh's revelations take on new urgency. A small drawing of a pickaxe crossed with a uranium atom symbol, the unofficial logo of the government's off-books mining operations. "Someone's been watching us," Jake said quietly as they surveyed the damage. "They knew exactly when we'd be away and how long we'd be gone. Sheriff's deputies from the county had taken statements and photographs, but their investigation felt perfunctory. The lead deputy, a young man who kept glancing nervously at his watch, seemed more interested in wrapping up the paperwork than finding the arsonist. "Any idea who might want to drive you off the property, ma'am?" he asked, but his tone suggested he was asking out of obligation rather than genuine interest in finding answers. "Several people have expressed concerns about my presence here," Nora said carefully, "including some federal agents who visited earlier this week." The deputy's pen stopped moving across his notepad. "Federal agents? What kind of federal agents?" "FBI. They seemed very interested in keeping me away from certain parts of the town." Jake watched the deputy's reaction closely. The young man's face had gone pale, and he was now writing with considerably more attention to detail. "Did they give you their names?" Agent Harrison was the senior agent. "I didn't catch his partner's name." The deputy closed his notepad abruptly. "Well, I think we have everything we need for now. If you think of anything else, give us a call." He was walking away before Nora could respond, moving with the urgent pace of someone who wanted to be anywhere but where he was. That evening, they returned to the general store to plan their next move. The apartment above the store was functional but felt exposed after the fire, every shadow potentially hiding another threat. Bandit remained close to Nora's side, clearly shaken by his experience, but alert to any new dangers. Jake had retrieved the key Vernon gave them from his truck, where it had survived the fire, along with the photographs they'd taken in the mine office. "We need to get to that safety deposit box," he said. "Whatever evidence Vernon's been keeping might be our only protection now." Protection from whom, exactly? Federal agents? Local law enforcement? Mining company security? Nora's frustration was evident in her voice. We don't even know who we're fighting. We're fighting people who think burning down houses and threatening people is an acceptable way to keep secrets, Jake replied. That's enough to know for now. Before they could make plans to visit the bank, they had another visitor. Father Miguel arrived just as the sun was setting, driving an old pickup truck and carrying a thermos of coffee and a bag of sandwiches. Heard about the fire, he said simply. Thought you might be hungry. The elderly priest was in his 80s, but moved with the steady grace of someone who had spent decades tending to people in crisis. He settled into one of the store's old chairs as if he belonged there, and Bandit immediately went to him for attention. You're the priest Vernon mentioned, Nora said. The one Linda Hartwell came to see before they disappeared. I am. And I've been expecting someone like you to show up eventually. Father Miguel's voice carried a weariness that spoke of carrying difficult truths for too long. 60 years is a long time to keep a confession of the dead. Jake leaned forward. A confession? Linda Hartwell came to me 3 days before her family vanished. She was terrified, not just for herself, but for Emma. The priest paused to sip his coffee, choosing his words carefully. She told me that Emma had been having visions, not dreams, but actual visions of people who had died in the mine. These spirits were trying to warn her about something dangerous. Dangerous how? According to Linda, the spirits told Emma that bad men were using the mine to make weapons that could hurt many people. They wanted Emma to tell someone in authority, but Linda was afraid that the wrong people might be the ones in authority. Father Miguel reached into his jacket and pulled out a small wooden cross, identical to the ones Nora had found. Linda brought me this the last time I saw her. She said if anything happened to her family, I should give it to someone who would understand its significance. The cross was warm from being carried close to the priest's heart, and when Nora examined it closely, she saw it had been carved with more detail than the others. On the back, in tiny letters, were the words, "Find the truth chamber." Truth chamber? Jake asked. I've wondered about that phrase for 60 years, Father Miguel admitted. Linda said Emma's spirits had told her to look for the truth chamber, that it contained proof of what the bad men were doing. A room in the mine system, Nora said with sudden understanding. Somewhere they kept records of the illegal uranium operation. Father Miguel nodded slowly. I believe so. And I believe that's where the Hartwell family was going when they died. They weren't just meeting Vernon for a casual exploration. They were going to document evidence of federal crimes. The priest's revelation put a new perspective on everything they'd learned. The Hartwells hadn't been random victims of a cover-up conspiracy. They'd been actively investigating the illegal uranium mining and were killed because they'd gotten too close to exposing the operation. Father, Nora said carefully, do you know where this truth chamber might be located? I have an idea. Linda mentioned that Emma's visions showed her a place deep underground where the walls were covered with papers and photographs. She said it was past the place where the sad voices were strongest. Jake frowned. The sad voices? The spirits of miners who died in earlier accidents. According to Emma, they clustered around one particular area of the mine system, the place where the worst tragedy had occurred. Father Miguel stood to leave, but before he went, he placed a hand on Nora's shoulder. Child, I don't know what you're planning to do with this information, but I want you to understand something. I've kept Linda's confession secret for 60 years because I believed speaking of it would only bring more tragedy. I'm telling you now because I'm old enough to meet my maker with a clear conscience, and because I think Emma's spirit deserves to rest in peace. You think she's still here? Still in the town? I think she's been waiting for someone to care enough about her story to risk everything to tell it. The priest's smile was sad but hopeful. You be careful, child. The dead can wait a little longer for justice, but the living still need you. After Father Miguel left, Nora and Jake sat in the growing darkness of the general store, surrounded by the remnants of lives interrupted and secrets buried. Outside, the desert wind whistled through empty buildings, but inside, the silence felt charged with possibility. We're going into that mine, Nora said finally. I know. It's going to be dangerous. The people who burned down the house aren't going to hesitate to hurt us if we get too close to whatever they're protecting. I know that too. Jake's calm acceptance surprised her. Why are you willing to risk this? You could walk away right now and no one would blame you. Because my grandfather spent 50 years feeling guilty about not finding the Hartwells. Because my great-uncle Vernon has been carrying secrets that have eaten away at him for 6 decades. Jake's voice was quiet but determined. And because a 6-year-old girl trusted adults to protect her, and we failed her completely, they spent the rest of the evening planning their descent into the mine system, using Robert Hartwell's journal and Emma's drawing to map out the most likely location of the truth chamber. They would need equipment, backup plans, and a way to document whatever they found that couldn't be destroyed or suppressed. But as Nora prepared for what might be the most dangerous night of her life, she felt something she hadn't experienced since David's death, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she needed to do. Emma Hartwell had been waiting 60 years for someone to hear her story. Tomorrow, one way or another, that wait would end. The safety deposit box at First National Bank in Cedar Falls contained 60 years of carefully preserved evidence, but it also contained something that changed everything. A sheriff's badge wrapped in tissue paper, tarnished with age, but unmistakably genuine. Attached to it was a note in Vernon's handwriting. This belonged to the real Sheriff Steele. The man who threatened me in 1964 was an imposter. Jake turned the badge over in his hands, examining the engraving and official markings. If this is the real sheriff's badge, then who was the man who covered up the murders? Nora felt the pieces of a much larger puzzle beginning to rearrange themselves in her mind. Someone with enough authority to impersonate a sheriff and enough resources to maintain a 60-year cover-up. The rest of the safety deposit box contents supported Vernon's shocking revelation. There were newspaper clippings from 1965 reporting that Sheriff James Steele had died in a car accident while pursuing leads in the Hartwell case. But the dates were wrong. According to Vernon's meticulous records, the man who claimed to be Sheriff Steele had visited him 2 weeks after the real sheriff's death. Vernon kept investigating after he was threatened, Nora said, reading through his handwritten notes. He discovered that someone had been using Sheriff Steele's identity to manage the cover-up, and that the real sheriff had been killed because he was getting too close to the truth. Among Vernon's papers was a photograph that made both of them catch their breath. It showed a man in sheriff's uniform standing beside a black sedan, but his face was clearly visible and definitely not the James Steele from official police photographs. Written on the back in Vernon's careful script, federal agent posing as Sheriff Steele, November 1964. The federal government didn't just cover up the murders, Jake said slowly. They murdered a sheriff and replaced him with their own agent to control the investigation. But the most shocking revelation was in Vernon's final notes, dated just weeks before his death. Through decades of careful research and discreet investigation, he had identified the man who had impersonated Sheriff Steele. His name was Marcus Thornfield, and according to Vernon's research, he was still alive and living under an assumed identity in Phoenix. Marcus Thornfield was a CIA operative specializing in domestic security operations, Nora read from Vernon's notes. After the Millfield operation, he was officially transferred to South America. But he actually remained in the Southwest under the identity of Michael Sterling, a mining consultant. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Jake, Michael Sterling is the name of the man who's been paying the property taxes on the sealed mine sections. I saw his name on the courthouse records when I bought the town. You mean the person responsible for the Hartwell murders has been maintaining control of the crime scene for 60 years? Vernon's final entry provided the answer. Sterling Thornfield has been using the Millfield mine as a base for ongoing federal operations. The uranium extraction never stopped. It just became more sophisticated and more carefully hidden. Emma Hartwell didn't just stumble onto a historical crime. She discovered an active federal black site. The phone rang, interrupting their discovery. Jake answered, and Nora watched his face go pale as he listened to the caller. "That was the retirement home," he said when he hung up. "Uncle Vernon died in his sleep last night. Natural causes, they said. 24 hours after giving us this evidence? That's not natural causes. That's elimination of a witness." As if summoned by their conversation, Nora's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Desert Rose Coffee Shop, Cedar Falls. 1 hour. Come alone or Jake Morrison joins Vernon Walsh." The message was followed by a photograph that made Nora's blood run cold. It showed Jake's truck parked outside the bank, taken from an angle that suggested the photographer had been watching them for some time. "They've been following us," she said, showing Jake the phone. "They know exactly what we found in that safety deposit box." Jake studied the message grimly. "You're not going to meet them alone." "I don't think we have a choice. Vernon spent 60 years trying to expose this conspiracy, and they killed him the moment he shared the evidence with someone else. If we don't cooperate, we'll just become 2 more victims." But as they prepared to leave the bank, Nora noticed something in Vernon's papers that gave her an idea. Among his research materials was a business card for an investigative journalist named Sarah Chen, with a handwritten note. "If something happens to me, give her everything." Vernon had a backup plan, Nora said, showing Jake the card. He knew this day would come, and he prepared for it. They made copies of all the evidence, hiding sets in multiple locations around Cedar Falls, and mailing another set to Sarah Chen with instructions not to open it unless they failed to check in within 48 hours. It wasn't perfect protection, but it was better than walking into a confrontation with no insurance. The drive to Desert Rose Coffee Shop felt like driving to their own execution. But Nora forced herself to think strategically. Whoever was behind the Millfield conspiracy had spent 6 decades maintaining control through intimidation and selective elimination. They wouldn't risk exposure by killing 2 people in a public place unless they were absolutely certain they could control the narrative. The coffee shop was busy with afternoon customers, which provided some measure of safety. Agent Harrison was waiting in a corner booth, but he wasn't alone. Sitting across from him was a man in his 70s with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Even without the identification, Nora knew she was looking at Marcus Thornfield, the man who had murdered a sheriff and 3 innocent people to protect a federal black operation. "Miss Caldwell," Harrison said as she approached the table, "thank you for coming. I'd like you to meet my supervisor, Director Sterling." Sterling's smile was cold and practiced. "Please, sit down. We have a great deal to discuss about your future." As Nora took the chair across from the 2 men, she realized that the next few minutes would determine not just her own fate, but whether the truth about Emma Hartwell's murder would ever see the light of day. Sterling had been covering his tracks for 60 years, and he clearly had no intention of stopping now. "I understand you've been exploring some of Millfield's history," Sterling said conversationally. "Ancient history, really. Nothing that has any relevance to current concerns." "Murder doesn't become ancient history just because time passes," Nora replied. "Emma Hartwell was 6 years old. She deserved better than being buried in a mine shaft and forgotten." Sterling's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Emma Hartwell died because her parents made poor choices about matters they didn't understand. Sometimes tragedy is simply the result of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And Sheriff Steele, was he also in the wrong place at the wrong time? For the first time, Sterling's composure cracked slightly. "I see Vernon Walsh told you quite a story before his unfortunate passing." The old man had a vivid imagination, especially in his final years. He had evidence, photographs, documents, official records that prove you murdered a sheriff and took his place to cover up federal crimes. Evidence can be interpreted many different ways, Ms. Caldwell, and unfortunately, the only person who could authenticate Vernon's claims is no longer available to do so. The threat was clear, but Nora pressed forward. "What's in the mine now? What's so important that you've spent 60 years killing people to protect it? Sterling leaned back in his chair, studying her with the calculating gaze of a predator, deciding whether its prey was worth the effort to kill. That, my dear, is exactly the wrong question to ask. Sterling's proposition was as elegant as it was horrifying. Nora would receive $2 million in cash, enough to disappear anywhere in the world and start a new life. In exchange, she would sign ownership of Millfield back to a federal holding company and never speak of what she'd discovered. Jake would receive a similar offer, and both of them would have 48 hours to leave the state permanently. And if we refuse? Nora asked, though she already knew the answer. Then you'll join the Hartwells, Sterling said simply. Industrial accidents are unfortunately common in abandoned mining areas. Cave-ins, toxic gas leaks, equipment failures, so many ways for curious people to meet unfortunate ends. The meeting ended with Sterling handing her a business card with a phone number written on the back. Call that number when you've made your decision. Don't take too long. My patience isn't what it used to be. As they left the coffee shop, Nora felt the weight of Vernon's evidence in her jacket pocket and the certainty that this was their last chance to expose the truth. Sterling had made it clear that acceptance of his offer was really the only option he would tolerate. The money was just window dressing on what amounted to a death sentence with a 48-hour delay. We have to go into that mine tonight, she told Jake as they drove back toward Millfield. It's the only way to get evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away. It's suicide. Sterling's people will be watching every approach to the mine entrance. Then we don't use the main entrance. Nora pulled out the mine map Vernon had preserved for 60 years. According to this, there are 3 natural cave openings that connect to the mine system. One of them is about 2 miles east of town, hidden in a rock formation that can't be seen from the main road. Jake studied the map while she drove, tracing the underground passages with his finger. Even if we can get in undetected, we're talking about navigating miles of underground tunnels with no backup and no way to call for help if something goes wrong. Jake, they're going to kill us anyway. Sterling didn't offer us money because he's generous. He offered it because he wants to control the timing and method of our deaths. At least this way, we have a chance to expose what happened to Emma before we join her. The next few hours were spent in careful preparation. They gathered mining equipment from Jake's contractor supplies, headlamps, rope, emergency breathing apparatus, and tools for breaking through any barriers they might encounter underground. More importantly, they set up a dead man's switch. If they didn't check in with Sarah Chen by 6 a.m., she would receive all of Vernon's evidence, along with instructions to release it immediately to every major news outlet. As darkness fell over Millfield, they made their final preparations in the general store. Bandit seemed to sense the danger they were heading into and refused to leave Nora's side, whining softly whenever she moved toward the door. I can't take you with me, boy, she told him, kneeling to scratch behind his ears. But I need you to stay here and guard the store. If we don't come back, Sarah Chen will need this place exactly as we left it. The dog looked at her with eyes that held too much understanding, then settled onto his blanket with a resigned sigh. He would wait, as he had learned to wait for David, as he had waited for Nora to find her purpose in this forgotten town. The hike to the cave entrance took them across terrain that was treacherous even in daylight, following game trails and dry washes while avoiding the roads where Sterling's people might be watching. The cave opening was exactly where Vernon's map indicated, hidden behind a screen of desert scrub and accessible only by crawling through a narrow gap between fallen boulders. Inside, the cave quickly opened into a natural passage that sloped downward into the earth. The air was cool and carried the metallic scent that Jake recognized from his years of construction work in areas with high mineral content. This connects to the mine system about half a mile underground, he said, checking the map by headlamp. From there, we follow the main shaft east until we reach the natural cavern system where the Hartwells died. The descent was slow and careful, with rope anchored at regular intervals to ensure they could find their way back in the dark. After an hour of steady climbing down through increasingly narrow passages, they reached the connection point where the natural cave joined the man-made mine tunnels. The difference was immediately apparent. The mine shafts were square-cut and reinforced with timber that showed signs of recent maintenance. Electric lights were strung along the ceiling, currently dark, but obviously functional. Most tellingly, the air here carried the hum of distant machinery. "This isn't an abandoned mine," Jake whispered. "Someone's been maintaining this place for decades." They followed the main shaft deeper underground, moving carefully and stopping frequently to listen for sounds of activity. After 20 minutes of travel, they began to hear voices echoing from somewhere ahead, men talking in the casual tones of people performing routine work. Nora motioned for Jake to stop, and they listened carefully to the distant conversation. The words were unclear, but the tone suggested normal work activity rather than any kind of alert or search operation. Whatever Sterling's people were doing down here, they weren't expecting visitors. The map showed the truth chamber was located in a side passage that branched off from the main shaft just before it reached the active work area. Getting to it would require passing close enough to the workers to be seen if they weren't careful. There, Jake pointed to a parallel tunnel that ran alongside the main shaft. "If we can reach that service tunnel, we can bypass the work area and come at the truth chamber from the other side." The service tunnel was narrower and less well-maintained than the main passages, but it provided the concealment they needed. As they crawled through the cramped space, they could hear the activity in the main shaft more clearly. Heavy equipment moving, men giving instructions. The steady hum of generators powering whatever operations Sterling was protecting. When they finally reached the branching passage that led to the truth chamber, Nora felt a strange combination of anticipation and dread. They were close to the answers that Emma Hartwell had died trying to find. But they were also deep underground, in a facility controlled by people who had killed to protect their secrets. The truth chamber itself was hidden behind a steel door that looked like it belonged in a bank vault rather than a mine. But the lock was electronic, and the red light on its display indicated it was secured with modern technology that they had no hope of bypassing. "Dead end," Jake said grimly. "Oh, we can't get through that door without the access code." But as they stood in the passage, studying the vault door by headlamp, Nora heard something that made her heart race, the sound of a little girl humming. Coming from somewhere beyond the steel barrier, Emma was still here, still waiting after 60 years for someone to find her truth, and somehow, some way, Nora was going to get that door open. The humming stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving only the distant sound of machinery and their own breathing in the underground passage. But the electronic lock on the vault door was blinking now, its red light shifting to amber as if responding to some unseen presence. "Did you see that?" Jake whispered, pointing to the display panel. Before Nora could respond, the lock clicked softly and the light turned green. The heavy steel door swung open on silent hinges, revealing a chamber that took both of their breaths away. The truth chamber was exactly what Emma's visions had shown her. A natural cavern whose walls were covered with documents, photographs and maps spanning 60 years of illegal federal operations. But it wasn't just evidence of uranium mining. The chamber contained proof of weapons testing, human experimentation, and environmental disasters that had been covered up by the same people who had murdered the Hartwell family. "My God," Jake breathed, stepping into the chamber with his headlamp illuminating rows of filing cabinets and document storage boxes. "This isn't just about Millfield. This is documentation of federal crimes going back to the 1950s. Nora moved to a wall covered with photographs, her light revealing images that made her stomach turn. Test subjects in hospital beds, environmental damage from chemical spills, and lists of names under the heading "Terminated for security reasons." The Hartwell family was just 3 names among hundreds. In the center of the chamber stood a desk with a modern computer system, its screens glowing softly in the darkness. Someone had been using this space recently. maintaining the records and adding new documentation to the archive of secrets. "Look at this," Jake called from a filing cabinet near the back of the chamber. He was holding a folder marked Active Operations that contained shipping manifests dated within the last month. "They're still mining uranium down here." The operation never stopped. Nora began photographing everything systematically with her phone, focusing on the documents that directly linked Sterling to the Hartwell murders and the ongoing cover-up. But as she worked, she became aware of another presence in the chamber, not threatening, but watchful. In the corner of her vision, she caught glimpses of a small figure in a white dress, always just at the edge of her headlamp's reach. Emma was here, guiding them to the most important evidence, making sure they found what they needed to expose the truth. The computer system proved to be unlocked, its screens showing current surveillance feeds from throughout the mine complex. On one monitor, Nora could see Sterling and 3 other men in what appeared to be a command center, studying building blueprints and discussing something with obvious urgency. "They're planning something," she said, calling Jake over to look at the surveillance feed. "Something that requires studying the structural layout of the entire mine system." As they watched, Sterling pointed to specific locations on the blueprint and spoke into a radio. Within moments, they could hear the distant sound of explosions echoing through the mine. Tunnels, controlled detonations that shook, dust from the ceiling of the truth chamber. "They're sealing the entrances," Jake said with growing alarm. "They know we're down here, and they're making sure we never leave." The computer system's communication logs revealed the full scope of Sterling's plan. He had decided that the Millfield operation was too compromised to continue, and he was implementing what the files called Total Sanitization Protocol, the complete destruction of the mine complex and everything in it. According to this timeline, "They're going to flood the entire system with toxic gas in 30 minutes, Nora said, reading from the emergency protocols displayed on the screen. "Anyone trapped underground will be dead within minutes of exposure." But Emma's presence grew stronger as the danger increased, and Nora began to understand that the little girl's spirit had been waiting 60 years, not just for someone to find the truth, but for someone who could use it to prevent Sterling from completing his plan. On the computer's hard drive, they found a complete roster of everyone involved in the Millfield operation, including current federal officials who had been receiving bribes and protection money for decades. More importantly, they found Sterling's contingency plans, the locations of 3 other similar facilities operating under different cover stories. "We have to get this information out," Nora said, copying files onto every storage device they had brought. "Even if we don't survive, this evidence has to reach the outside world." Jake was studying the mine schematics on the computer, looking for alternative escape routes. "There's a maintenance shaft that connects to the old mine entrance, but it's on the other side of the flooded section. We'd have to go through the area where they're setting off explosions." As if, in response to their desperation, the little girl in the white dress became visible for a moment in the corner of the chamber. Emma pointed toward a section of the cavern wall that looked identical to every other section, but when Nora approached it, she found it was actually a concealed door. Behind the door was a narrow passage that didn't appear on any of the mine schematics, a natural cave system that the miners had discovered but never mapped. Emma's spirit had found their escape route, just as she had found the evidence they needed to expose her murderers. "This way," Nora called to Jake, gathering the last of the critical evidence files. "Emma's showing us the way out." As they prepared to leave the truth chamber, Nora took one last look around the cavern that had held secrets for 60 years. On the computer screen, the countdown timer showed 23 minutes until total sanitization. They would have to move fast and trust a 6-year-old girl's spirit to guide them through passages that might not have been traveled by living people in decades. But as they entered the hidden passage, following Emma's faint form deeper into the mountain, Nora felt a certainty that had been building since the day Bandit first started digging behind the general store. This was why she had been brought to Millfield, why her grief over David's death had led her to buy an abandoned town on impulse. Emma Hartwell had been waiting for someone who understood loss, someone who would care enough about a child's murder to risk everything for justice. The passage ahead was dark and uncertain, but for the first time in 5 years, Nora knew exactly where she belonged. The hidden passage Emma led them through was older than the mine system, carved by water over thousands of years, and connecting natural chambers that had never appeared on any survey. They moved as quickly as they dared, following the faint shimmer of Emma's white dress through darkness that seemed to swallow their headlamps' beams. Behind them, the sound of explosions grew closer as Sterling's people systematically destroyed the evidence of their 60-year operation. The countdown timer Nora had seen on the computer screen meant they had less than 15 minutes before toxic gas would be released throughout the entire mine complex. "This passage is heading upward," Jake said, checking his compass and altimeter. "If Emma's leading us to safety, she's taking us toward the surface." The natural cave system was treacherous in places, with loose rock and sudden drops that could have killed them if they'd been moving without a guide. But Emma's spirit seemed to know every hazard, pausing at dangerous sections and leading them around obstacles that their headlamps couldn't illuminate in time. As they climbed higher through the cave system, they began to hear new sounds from behind them. Not explosions, but voices. Sterling's people had discovered their escape route and were following them through the hidden passages. "They're gaining on us," Nora said, hearing the echo of boots on stone getting closer. "How much farther to the surface?" Emma's form flickered more brightly ahead of them, and suddenly she was pointing not upward toward the surface, but toward a side passage that seemed to lead deeper into the mountain. For a moment, Nora hesitated. Following that path would take them away from escape, closer to the danger they were trying to flee. But then she understood. Emma wasn't just leading them to safety. She was leading them to the place where her family had died, the place where the truth could finally be told. The side passage opened into a natural chamber that took their breath away. It was huge, easily the size of a cathedral, with mineral formations glittering in their headlamp beams. And in the center of the chamber, exactly as the evidence photos had shown, were 3 forms lying at the bottom of what had once been a mine shaft. After 60 years, Robert, Linda, and Emma Hartwell were finally going to be found. "We have to document this," Nora said, photographing the scene while Jake used his phone's GPS to record their exact location. "This proves everything: the murder scene, the cover-up, the fact that they were never lost in any flood." Emma's spirit was stronger here than it had been anywhere else. No longer a flickering presence at the edge of vision, but clearly visible as the 6-year-old girl she had been in life. She stood beside her parents' remains, waiting patiently for someone to finally see what had been hidden for so long. The sound of their pursuers was getting closer, but Nora found herself reluctant to leave this place. Being here, seeing the Hartwell family together, felt like completing a promise she had made without realizing it. "Thank you," she whispered to Emma's spirit. "Thank you for trusting me to find you." Emma smiled, the first time Nora had seen her look truly happy, and pointed toward another passage that led out of the chamber. This one was wider than the route they had taken, clearly a natural exit that would bring them to the surface, well away from the mine complex. As they prepared to leave, Jake noticed something glinting near Robert Hartwell's remains. It was a small recording device, ancient by modern standards, but still intact after 6 decades underground. "He was documenting everything," Jake said, carefully retrieving the device. "If this still works, it might contain Robert's own account of what they discovered." The pursuers' voices were close enough now that they could make out individual words. Sterling himself was among them, his voice carrying the controlled fury of someone whose carefully maintained secrets were unraveling. "Find them," he was saying. "They have evidence that could destroy operations across 3 states. Whatever it takes, they cannot reach the surface." Emma's spirit began to fade as they left the chamber where her family lay, but her work was done. She had guided them to the truth, shown them the evidence they needed, and given them a path to escape. After 60 years of waiting, her vigil was finally over. The passage Emma had shown them led steadily upward through natural caves that had been carved by underground water flows. As they climbed, they could see faint light ahead, not artificial illumination, but the grey light of dawn filtering through an opening to the surface. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had stopped, replaced by the distant rumble of controlled explosions as Sterling's people implemented their sanitization protocol. The entire mine complex was being destroyed, along with any evidence that might have remained in the truth chamber. But they had what they needed. The files on Nora's phone and storage devices contained proof of 60 years of federal crimes, including the murder of the Hartwell family and dozens of other victims. More importantly, they had the location of Emma's remains, and Jake's recording device might contain Robert Hartwell's own testimony about what they had discovered. The cave opening led them onto a hillside about 3 miles from Millfield, hidden among rocks and desert scrub where Sterling's people wouldn't think to look. As they emerged into the dawn light, they could see smoke rising from the direction of the mine complex and hear the distant sound of sirens as emergency responders reacted to what would officially be described as an industrial accident. "We made it," Jake said, sitting heavily on a boulder while they both caught their breath. "Emma brought us home." Nora looked back toward Millfield, now visible in the distance as the sun rose over the desert. Somewhere beneath that peaceful-looking town, the truth chamber was being destroyed, and the evidence of decades of crimes was being buried under tons of rock and poison gas. But the most important evidence was here with them, along with the location of 3 innocent people who could finally be laid to rest with dignity. As they began the hike back to town, Nora felt Emma's presence one last time, not the frightened, waiting spirit she had been for 60 years, but the happy child she had been in life. Finally free to rest in peace, knowing that her story would be told. The battle wasn't over. Sterling and his associates would fight to suppress what they had discovered, and there would be danger ahead as powerful people worked to protect their secrets. But Emma Hartwell was no longer alone with the truth about what had happened to her family, and that, Nora realized, had been worth everything. 6 months later, the Hartwell family was laid to rest in the Cedar Falls Cemetery, their funeral attended by more than 300 people who had waited 60 years to say goodbye. The headstone was simple granite with their names and dates. But underneath the official information, Nora had insisted on one additional line: their truth lives on. Sarah Chen's investigative series had exposed not just the Millfield conspiracy, but the entire network of illegal federal operations that Sterling had managed for 6 decades. The recordings on Robert Hartwell's device had provided first-hand testimony about the uranium mining operation and the threats his family had received for trying to expose it. Sterling was awaiting trial on federal charges that would ensure he spent his remaining years in prison. Nora stood at the graveside as the service concluded, watching families reunite with relatives they thought they had lost forever. Vernon Walsh's nephew had flown in from California to finally understand why his uncle had carried such guilt for so many years. Jake stood beside her, his own burden of family secrets finally lifted after 3 generations of silence. "They're at peace now," Father Miguel said, approaching them as the crowd began to disperse. The elderly priest had officiated the service, speaking about justice delayed but not denied, about the importance of bearing witness to truth even when it came at great cost. "I can feel it," Nora replied, and she could. For months after their escape from the mine, she had continued to sense Emma's presence in Millfield, a spirit waiting to see if justice would truly be served. But today, as they lowered the family's remains into consecrated ground, that presence had finally faded into peaceful rest. The town of Millfield itself had been permanently sealed by federal order. The entire area declared an environmental hazard zone due to decades of illegal mining operations. But Nora had managed to salvage what mattered most: Emma's belongings, the family photographs, and the small wooden cross that would forever remind her of a little girl's courage in the face of unimaginable danger. Jake had stayed in Cedar Falls, using his contractor skills to help other families affected by the conspiracy rebuild their lives. The government compensation fund established in the wake of Sarah Chen's investigation would provide financial support, but healing the emotional damage would take much longer. "What will you do now?" Jake asked as they walked away from the cemetery. Over the months of investigation and testimony, they had grown close, bonded by shared danger and the understanding that they had been part of something larger than themselves. "I think I'm going to go home," Nora said, and realized she meant it. For the first time since David's death, the idea of returning to their cabin in the mountains felt right. She had carried her grief for 5 years, like a weight that grew heavier with time, but helping Emma find peace had somehow lightened her own burden. "The cabin where you and David lived. It's time. I've been running from his memory instead of honoring it, hiding from the life we built together instead of celebrating what we shared." She smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. "David would have loved this story, you know. He always believed that some things were worth fighting for. Even when the odds seemed impossible, they drove back through the desert landscape that had become so familiar over the past months, past the roadblock that now permanently sealed access to Millfield. Bandit rode in the passenger seat, alert and content, his own mission in this strange adventure apparently complete. At the general store where their investigation had begun, they made one final stop. Nora had decided to donate the building to the County Historical Society, along with Emma's notebook and drawings, so that future generations would remember what had happened here. "She saved us," Jake said, looking up at the apartment window, where Nora had first dreamed of Emma's voice calling for her mother. "A 6-year-old girl who died 60 years ago literally saved our lives. She saved more than our lives. She saved the truth." Nora locked the general store door for the last time, leaving behind the place where her own healing had begun. "Sometimes that's the most important thing we can do, bear witness to truth, even when it's difficult or dangerous." As they prepared to part ways, Jake pulled something from his truck and handed it to her. It was a small wooden horse, carved with the same careful attention Emma's father had brought to her wooden cross. "I made this for you," he said, suddenly shy, "to remember her by." The horse was beautiful, capturing the spirit of freedom and movement that had filled Emma's drawings. As Nora held it, she could almost hear the sound of a little girl's laughter, finally free to run through meadows that existed beyond the darkness of underground chambers. "Thank you," she said, and meant it for so much more than the carved horse. The drive back to her mountain cabin took her through landscape that had once felt empty and meaningless, but now seemed filled with possibility. She had left this place 5 years ago as a broken woman, fleeing from memories she couldn't bear to face. She was returning as someone who understood that healing came not from avoiding grief, but from finding purpose in the midst of it. Bandit bounded out of the truck when they reached the cabin, immediately beginning his own investigation of familiar scents and forgotten territories. The building looked smaller than Nora remembered, but solid and welcoming. This was where she belonged, where she could honor David's memory while building whatever came next in her life. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains David had loved to climb, Nora sat on the porch where they had spent so many peaceful hours planning their future together. Bandit lay at her feet, and Emma's wooden horse sat on the table beside her coffee cup, catching the last light of day. For the first time since David's death, Nora felt truly at peace. She had learned that some losses could never be healed, only transformed into something that gave meaning to the time that remained. Emma Hartwell had taught her that justice was worth fighting for. That truth had power even when it seemed hopeless. And that love, whether for a husband lost to an avalanche or a child murdered for knowing too much, could transcend death itself. As the first stars appeared in the mountain sky, Nora whispered a prayer of gratitude for a little girl's courage and a dog's persistence. for the people who had helped her find truth in the darkness, and for the unexpected ways that healing could come to those who opened their hearts to other people's pain. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new possibilities. But tonight, surrounded by memories that no longer hurt and dreams that felt possible again, Nora Caldwell was exactly where she needed to be. Emma Hartwell was finally at rest, and so was she.